Hello guys, and you're welcome. The splines tool can be a bit intimidating when you're starting using Substance Designer because it's a new tool already. So in this tutorial, what I hope to do is to demystify and break it down into a part series. It'll be broken down into separate videos, and each video is going to have a specific project. So let's jump in and learn about the path and spline tools in Substance Designer.
Hello guys, and you're welcome. So in this tutorial we're going to build this basic material using the spline tools in Substance Designer, and we're not going to be using any shape. We're simply going to be using the spline tools. So I'll just go ahead and create a new project. So what I'll do is just go to file and go to new, and I'll create a new substance graph, and I'll just call this one splines lessons _01 and leave everything at the default and click OK so I can have a nice empty project to begin with. Now I'm using a cloth as the material, so if I go to the scene, I'm just using cloth, but feel free to use any of these materials you want to use to display your final result. Also, you notice my window is slightly different, so if I go to Windows and reset layout, I'm going to reset everything to the default layout so we can always be on the same page. And the way I set this up was to drag the 3D view and share it with the Explorer window like so. And then for the 2D view, I'm sharing that with the library window and just dropping this here so I can have a little extra space to work with. To use the spline and path tools, you need to first make a few changes. So I'm going to go to Edit, Preferences, click on Projects, and we just basically want to make sure we're using Substance Engine v9, which supports the path and spline tools, and I'll hit apply and hit OK. So if I go over to the library and click on the spline and path, I just drag this over here and just drag this view so we can see on the spline and path tools. One shortcut I really love using is each time you're on a specific window and you hold shift and spacebar, it will maximize that window, and over here I can just use this to set this to large icons so we can see this large icons. So these are all the spline tools and these are all the path tools. You can think about splines like vector lines or shapes you can create using your Bezier handles, and it has a lot more tools, but mostly you'll be using the spline circle, the spline cubic, and then also the spline polyquadratic, because this is what you're going to use to create your splines. Your path tools, on the other hand, are great tools that actually are a bridge between your path and your splines. Basically your shape and your splines, you actually use these tools to recreate them. And all this is sounding like magic. Let's just go ahead and jump into the project and start doing. So I'll just press shift and space bar. So right here in my view, I'll just hit the space button and I'm going to search for spline, and I'll hit on the spline cubic, and right here on the scene we can see we have a cubic spline, and then over here we have this Bezier handles, and what we can do is to begin to kind of like change these handles like so. So if I wanted something that looks like petals, because in my example I kind of like spread petals around, I'll just drag this handle over here like so, and I begin to push and pull each of these edges. In fact, let's hit our control and space bar and then zoom in so we can have a very nice, path and view to see. So this is going to be my first shape. In fact, I can even place this across the center, and notice something here. You can actually see this arrow. So it's telling us that we're starting from here and we're going all round to this edge right here. Right, and then we have these classic Bezier handles which we can use to pull, redirect, or to shape this path along like so, this spline. So that's this spline right here. If I want to chain or recreate another one, what I can do is to click on this, and I'll do my Control D, and what I can do is just drag this and pass this in here. So that means I actually have two of these. If I double click on the preview, I can see it on the preview window. In case you can't see it here, just press F to focus this over here. So it means I have just chained these two splines together. There is a special node you can actually use in case you want to kind of like group and join these together. So, and we're also going to be looking at that simple node as well. So before we do that, let's make sure we are on this second one, and then let's try dragging these handles. So I'll just go over here and try dragging this handle, and you can see what I'm doing here is to recreate another one. So I'll just hit my spacebar, zoom in like so, and I'll just drag this handle and place this object over here like that. Like so. So I just want to place this here so we can just have some nice, petal shapes for like a plant per se. So I'll just go ahead and zoom out, press F to focus on this view, and I'll go back to my first one and just drag this handle because I want this to be kind of like here. So that's one way we can kind of like, start creating this path shapes. You can do a lot with this, and let's look at some of these settings right here. So right here, if I scroll down under the preview, I can decide to show or hide these tangents. So if I turn this to off, you can see we're not seeing these lines, these straight lines that are touching this curve, which is a tangent. If I set this back to true, we're not going to see that tangent. Again, if we look at this direction here, this is our direction helper. If we turn it off, it's going to hide that, pointer for our direction. I'll just set that back to true so we can see the direction we're working with. Also, under the preview, we can set the thickness amount. So if I drag this thickness, you can actually see we're getting our path to be very thick. So let's just go ahead and set this. Now, a note of warning, this is just a preview, but it doesn't represent the final output. So this is it. And also what you can do here on the points coordinates, we can actually, begin to drag these points and manipulate them. If we look at our graph view, our 2D view, we can see that output, but I prefer just using these handles or these point movers or the tangent holders here to just kind of like make these changes. Also over here, we can set things like the thickness. Let me just go ahead and open the instance parameters. We can open up the thickness, and we can set a start and an end thickness for our design. That's also possible to do that as well. So let's move on. So like I said, there are lots of ways to, combine this. If we have another spline cubic, so let's go ahead and hit the space bar, and let's do a spline cubic. Oh, let's just go over here and drop another spline cubic like so, and try to make this into a kind of like floral flower petal shape. Now you can set this to any shape you want, that's totally fine. So we have these two splines here, two cubic splines, and we have another cubic spline here. This one, we just straight up connected it to this one, and then we have another spline cubic here, which is another petal, and we want to add this over here. How do we do that? Well, there's a nice node called the spline append node. So if you go to the library, click on the spline tools, and I'll just maximize this. If we just begin to look over here, we can actually see a spline append. Now, a quick way to find out what these tools do is when you leave your mouse cursor over it, it'll actually tell you what you're doing. It says splines are packaged as a list. This node appends a list of input splines set into an existing line, and you have to be mindful of the start and end position. So this is the spline we need. We need the append spline. So I'll just shift spacebar out of this view, hit the spacebar, and I'll search for append, or I can just type append, and we can actually see a path symbol with a plus on it. So I'll just click on this spline append, and I'll just drag this as the first one, and I'll drag this as the second spline right here, and we can see what's happening. We'll see this second spline we created right here is just, out of here. So what I'll do is to also kind of like undock this view, so I could just maximize this and place this anywhere and increase the size, because I noticed I've been using that window a lot. So I'll just undock this and place this right here. If for any reason you want to bring it back, just go ahead and click on dock window, and this should be docked right where you undocked it from. So I'll just click on undock window, and I'll have this right here. So I'll go over here to this spline, and what I'll do is to begin to move this point around so that I can have this nice, petal-like shape, or I could just drag it over here and kind of like begin to twist this around till I find a nice suitable position for it. So you can see how I'm just, kind of like rotating that and moving that around like so. So if that doesn't seem to solve, the issue I have, I can always, drag this edge right here too, just to move this, and then drag this over here to this edge. And let's just zoom out and just bring back that nice curvy shape, like so. And I'll make sure these points try to at least touch the edge so we can have a nice shape right here. So this is our spline shape, and remember, we can always go back to any of these and make these changes. All right, we can always zoom in, make our changes, kind of like look at those points and use those handles to move this around. Now when we're done with this, what we can also do is to append another spline to this one already. And if you also want to transform a spline, let's say for instance we want to transform this one, well, we have the spline transform. So let's go ahead and just open this, and let's dock this one back to where it was, and let's maximize this window again. And here we can see we have the spline 2D transform node. So if I just scroll over here, this is our spline 2D transform. I'll just drop this here and drag this spline first. And once I drop that in, I can now take this and pass this into our second. Basically, what I'm doing right here is to create a nice way to transform this spline. So if I'm on this and I begin to say rotate this, if I get back here and I click on this one and start rotating this, you can see I'm actually rotating this one, and it's updating right here. If I click on the preview, we can actually see it's updating this spline. So that's another way to transform the spline easily in case you want to do that. If we want to quickly view any section of our spline, let's say we want to quickly view this one, we can use the spline render node to just have a overall view of how that spline is going to look like. And to do that, let's just go to the library, or you could search here and we could just say spline. I'll do a spline render, like so, and we can render any of these splines at any point. But note, each time you use a spline render node, you're actually exiting spline node. And if you want to know whether you're still in spline node or exiting spline node, you can see a single output, and this is going to be the output of our render. So let's kind of like view this right here, and this is our rendered output. This is our spline is going to look like, and there are some settings here. For instance, we can increase the segment resolution by turning this to 64. I believe we can even bump this to a higher number, but note you're actually going to be it's memory performant, and that's what you're. So this is the basic spline view, and this is the render output of this spline. I believe this is the best place to use the render, and let's just drop this here, and we can see our final spline output. And I actually see that I need to set this spline here. So this is not the transform. I could just go back to the spline cubic and kind of like zoom in and begin to make changes to those handles. So I could just set this right here and right here as well. So what we are actually going to do next is to use the spline poly quadratic, because we've just been using the spline cubic. And to do that, let's just hit the space bar and say spline poly, I think it's poly quadratic sometimes if I don't get the spelling well. So it's just a spline poly quadratic, and what this does is to bring out a spline node with a set of points, which you can always increase these points. You can also set the number of your points, and you can also check the curvature of your points, and has more inputs for coordinates. You can also increase the total count. Let's say for instance I have the points amount set to 4. I can set this to a maximum of 10. If I need more points, I could just turn on the point lists. I'll just write down here. So let's see direction to point. I just saw point lists right now, but either way, if we turn on the points lists, we can pass in a point list as an input to increase the amount of points we actually have in our graph. So that's how we can do that. Apologies, the point lists option has evaded me right now. We can do things like, close our spine. Okay, here it is. Use input point lists. There you go. So if we turn this on, it's going to ask us for a point number, and we can easily search for a point list, and then kind of like add in those specific points we want. So here I'm just going to drag this point list and drop it here, and I can set the point number to, let's say, 2 more. So if I go back over here, what I can actually see is that I'm going to have more inputs to use for this point right here. So I'm actually using this point list. If I click on this, we can actually see that. So I'm not going to use that, so I'll just delete this and go to my spline quadratic and press F to center this, so we can actually see this, right? So I'll just leave this at 4 points, and we can begin to also manipulate this. So let's just maximize this view and start dragging in our point lists like so. Now this gives more flexible options, as you can see, but it's pretty much, quite similar to our basic, our spline list. You can actually use this to create your shapes like so. So we have point 1 coming together with point 4, and we can still do the same thing right here. So before I set the render, what I want to do is to just duplicate this append spline. So I'll just do a Control D to duplicate that and get rid of all these inputs. And what I'll do is to drag this at the top and then drag this and set this at the bottom. And what we actually notice is that this is not aligned. So if I just go over here, we actually can see that this is not aligned. So I'll just maximize this just to show you. So to do that, what we can simply do is to just go over here to our spline, make sure we're on this one. I'll just press F to set that view, and I'll go over here to my spline polyquadratic, just click that once, and I'll just either undock or zoom in. And what I'm simply going to do is just set this at this point, just to make this at the center, and then I'll use the handles over here to just drag this petal shape down here, just drag this and just have fun manipulating this. Like, you can do very complex designs, but like I said, we just want to do something quite basic like so. And with that, what I'm simply going to do is to duplicate this one right here and pass it in. So I'll just I'll drag everything to the left right here. So what I'm going to do is to simply duplicate this. So I'll just do a Control D, select this one, Control D to duplicate this. So with this duplicated, what I'm simply going to do is just pass this in like so, and you can see we have our polyquadratic spline again. But what I need to do now is to just drag this edge so that this can be our last point like so. So I'll just drag this over here. So you see various methods, very different techniques, very different methods to quickly, kind of like create this and set this into any pattern you want. So I'll just drag this to make this slightly big. So I'll just leave it at this, and then finally what we can do is to just take the render and plug in the render like so. So this is going to be our final output. Let's turn the, we have a large segment amount. I think this is super great and this is okay. We can begin to do things like set the envelope amount. So let me just undock this and make this quite big. So over here we can do things like set the envelope spline amount, set a start and end. So you can actually see we're, kind of creating some interesting stuff right here. So with this, what I can do is to take this one, duplicate this, combine it with another one and transform it. So we can, let me just show you what I mean instead of explaining this. So I'll just do a Control D. So I have 2 of this, and this is my spline render view. So here it's just showing me the spline data, but if you double click on the preview, it's showing you that preview. So here on the spline render, sorry, let me just undo this. So on the spline render, like I said, I could duplicate this like so, and then kind of like combine these two together, but I don't want this to be beyond the scope of what we're doing here. So I'll set this back, and we could just set our amount like so. Alright, so we can set a start and an end, we can drag the start and also drag the end, so we can have, you know, kind of like something super unique and fun to play with. So let's just set the start and end point to 0. We can do things like increase the thickness of our spline just to make it kind of like more interesting. Right. So we can also do things like color, set the spline style to a solid gradient like so. So this will give it some kind of like nice effects, but I'll set this to solid so we have a unique, you know, output over here. So what can we do right now? We've created our spline, right? We've rendered our spline. We can do things like fill our spline using a spline fill tool. So I'll just press the space bar and I'll just do spline fill and just drop this in like this. And basically this is going to fill our spline using solid white. So you can actually see we just have this white solid fill. So it depends on which output I want to use. I can take this output and use it elsewhere, or I can take this output as well and use it elsewhere. So let's use the spline scatter on spline grayscale. So if I go over to this menu and let's just dock this back, we can actually see a scatter on spline grayscale, and this is going to be similar to the tile sampler node. So if I just go over here and search for my scatter on spline grayscale, or just search for it, there we are, and just drop this here. So I'm going to use this and set the input. So first you can see the under the instance parameters we have pattern, size, position, rotation, and color. This is quite similar to the tile sampler. So what I'm going to do is to pass in our spline like so. So I'm not going to use the render. I'll just use the this output. I can pass this in as an input, sorry, to our spline, and we can actually see it's scattering these circles around because under the pattern. And so this is mode. If I get back to my spline setup, under pattern is using disk. I can use a pattern input. Now it wants an input. It's looking for a pattern input 1. And for pattern input 1, I'll just drag this and pass this in here. And you can see it's actually scattering this spline shape over here like so. And let's go ahead and do some things here. I'll set this to 64. Again, we can even drag this one and pass this in. And you can see it's scattering our spline like so. So I prefer this version with the spline fill. So what we can do from here is to begin to do things like change the shape spacing on the scatter mode. So I'll just do it like this. And also under the size, we can increase the size. So I'll just increase the scale to a nice large amount, not too large, not too small. So we can actually have this right here. And what we can also do is to use the regular tile sampler to actually create our own patterns. So if I do a tile generator here, and I go over to the tile generator and set the pattern to image input, I can still take our image and pass it over here into the tile generator. So you can see you can start creating things like your styles, you know, setting your size, you know, bumping up the scale as well, setting things like the position. I'm just going to drag the offset here like so. I'll just set the global offset for X and slightly Y. And just drag this. You can actually see we can still use the tools we have. Let's get back to our scatter on spline grayscale. And what we can begin to do here is, apart from the scale, is to go over here at the top and do things like, you know, mess around with our spacing. And so what we can also do is to, instead of use it here, we can just take the output and use this as an input into the tile generator. And what we're actually seeing right here is that we have this same spline shape with scattered, you know, edges around it, and we can actually pass that into a tile generator. So basically we're taking this and then we are, creating a scattered design based on this input. Now what you can also do is to create multiple shapes here. So here, for instance, the pattern, I have the pattern input number, so I'll set this pattern input number to 2. This is going to give me a second input, and I can quickly do something like let's create a shape like so. And I'll set the scale. Let's drag the scale down a little bit for this shape. And then what I'm going to do is set this to a, in fact, let's use a polygon. I'll use polygon 1. And then I'll set the number of sides to 3 because I want a small triangular shape. And for the scale, I'll just drag down the scale a little bit so it's slightly smaller. Like so, and I can just pass that into my second input like so. And what we're going to observe right now is we have this triangle and the flower shape being scattered around the floral shape. So, and what we can do is to set the input distribution to pattern index. So it's always going to take the first one, second one, first shape, second shape, all around. So, and then when we get back to the tile generator, we can actually see this output. What we can also do is to combine this and pass that into our final design. And to do that, I'll just create a blur node and set the intensity to 0. And I'll pass this in as an input and begin to pass this to my normal. For my ambient, we can actually see it right here. It's not really colorful, so but for the ambient occlusion, I'm going to use a HBAO, the horizon based ambient occlusion, and pass that in as an input, and also drag in my blur over here. And what we can do is, since this is a cloth material, I don't want it to have a lot of reflection, so over here on the roughness, on the uniform color, I'll just drag this to a towards white. That means this is not a rough subject, right? And also for the uniform color for metallic, just drag this over here and just leave it as black. That means it's non-metallic, like so. For the color, what I'll do is to extract a curvature. So I'll just do a curvature here, and what this is going to do is just extract some of that data from our grayscale vector image. And then for the color, I'll create a gradient map for the color, and then what I'll do is to pass in this as the input into the gradient map. And with the gradient map selected, I'll open up the gradient editor, and what I'll do is to click on pick gradient. Sorry, not pick gradient. I'll just clear everything and undo this. Okay, all right, so I'll first add a start for the foreground. Let's select any color for the foreground. I'll just pick this nice, slightly dark yellow for the foreground. And then here for the background, I'll just pick a dark color like so. So I'll just set any color. In fact, we can add more colors if we want, just to make this slightly unique. I think I kind of like this, so we can actually see what we're working with right here. So for this, if I double click on this, I can set a bright value. And then we can add another one here. Basically, we can spend all day trying to figure out which colors we want to use, but I'll just leave it at this, monochromatic color right here. That's totally fine. What we can also do is to do things like add a nice HSL scale here. So I'll just look for HSL, and what this is going to do is to let us, desaturate. For instance, I can set this to 0.4. Let's do 0.4 just to get rid of some of that color. And then for the hue or lightness, I can set this to 0.6 to bump that up a little bit. So basically that's how we can play around with this and create some nice material using these patterns. And we can actually see that we're spreading these two colors all around, these two shapes rather, all around. So that's a quick, very rough introduction to how you can use the path and spline tools. There are other nodes, lots of nodes we can actually use. You can do things like UVs. We've seen how we can fill. We can use a bridge mapper. We can even play around with the UVs, and we can also combine splines using the bridge. And remember, each time you put your cursor over each of these points, it'll give you information about what that spline does. So thank you very much for watching. If you want to see another in-depth breakdown of how I created another material using the path to spline, basically we didn't use this path to spline, and using the path tools, I actually have a tutorial where I went over the path tools. You can also check that out. So thank you very much for watching. Please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.